Optimal health for high performers. This is the Health Upgrade Podcast with Dr. Nawaz Habib.
Welcome back to the Health Upgrade Podcast. This is Dr. Habib. Most people are trying to fix their vagus nerve by adding practices to their daily lives. Cold plunges, breathwork, apps, humming, vagus nerve stimulation devices, and all are good. But the issue for most people is that they're doing things that are actually causing their vagus nerve to not function well in the first place. They're actually sabotaging their vagus nerve. This is where today's episode comes in, because what we're going to talk about is subtraction and how it beats addition. Let's talk about the practices that are keeping you stuck in a sympathetic state, in a sympathetically dominant fight or flight state most of the time. And they're not exotic practices. These are actually the most common practices that I find people are doing in my practice when I'm talking to my clients. And these are ordinary results of modern life. And each one truly has a traceable mechanism through vagus nerve circuitry. So let's dig into the top 7 worst vagus nerve sabotaging habits and help you understand what might be holding you back from optimizing your vagus nerve function in the first place. The first mechanism, the first sabotaging habit is, without a doubt, alcohol. Alcohol is an acute sympathetic activator, and alcohol converts to acetaldehyde in the bloodstream and in the liver, and that actually heavily suppresses your vagus nerve activation for about 4 to 6 hours. And this happens because alcohol is a toxin. It's a toxin to the body. It's a toxin to the microbiome. It triggers nervous system regulation to be shut down. The problem is that most people are drinking right before they go to bed or in the few hours before bedtime, and alcohol creates a parasympathetic feeling. It actually feels good. It has a GABAergic sedation that's occurring, but that's mistaken for relaxation while creating a new toxin, a new burden for your body to have to handle. And what that does is it triggers overnight RMSSD HRV data to really typically drop between 20 and 40% after just 2 or more drinks, with an elevated resting heart rate the next morning. So the body is really stuck dealing with this toxin that it's trying to clear out through the liver and via the bloodstream and get rid of these toxins to eliminate basically this toxin from the body, and keeps us in a sympathetic state and actually shuts down the capability of the vagus nerve to do its normal parasympathetic role. And this is particularly a problem if it happens right before you're going to bed, because when you're going to sleep, what you're trying to do through sleep is actually activate the vagus nerve more effectively. And so for the 4 to 6 hours after you drink, if you're putting your body into a sympathetic state and decreasing your vagal tone, what you're doing is you're not giving the vagus nerve an opportunity to repair and recover through the night. And so here's a minimum effective fix: is stop 3 hours before bed. Stop drinking at minimum 3 hours before bed, or cap at 1 drink if you're going to. Never use alcohol as the wind down mechanism. And we'll get into what that means and how it can show up as almost this unhealthy coping mechanism, because it feels good, but in reality, it's more of a negative than positive. The second one I want to get into is late night eating, because digestion is a vagally mediated process, but eating late, eating within 2 or 3 hours of bedtime, actually activates a state that keeps us in a sympathetic drive. So for the first 2 or 3 hours after we eat, we actually go slightly sympathetic overall. We're going into a state where food needs to be broken down. It's an energy intensive process. And what this does is it's kind of creating an opportunity for us to not rest and to go into digest state. Rest and digest, I think, is a bit of a misnomer because we can either rest or we can digest. Both don't generally happen at the exact same time. So if we're going into a digest state, rest is going to be hindered. This is important to understand because what's happening as we're breaking down these foods and having those nutrients enter the bloodstream is it's causing this postprandial thermogenesis. It's increasing your body temperature through the night or post-meal, and it's creating an increase in glucose in the bloodstream, which is triggering insulin responses. And that is actually going to suppress your overnight heart rate variability. The trap is when we start to talk about it as only being a snack. Even a late, small intake blunts overnight vagal recovery. So it's really important that we stop eating all food for a minimum of 2 to 3 hours before bedtime. The marker here is the overnight HRV curve, and we tend to see even on heart rate, that heart rate slowly comes down during the night rather than dropping early in the night. And that's a problem here because that tells us that we're not entering that recovery mode as effectively as we want to be. The minimum effective fix for this, as I mentioned, is cutting off your food 2 to 3 hours before bed. If evening hunger is truly the driver, then address your protein intake, address your calorie distribution through the day, and figure out how you can limit your caloric intake before bed. Try drinking some water with some electrolytes, doing something a little bit different that isn't going to create this insulin response in your body while you're trying to go to sleep. The third mechanism that's sabotaging vagus nerve is sedentary living. It's the sitting. We've all heard that sitting is the new smoking. There's no doubt about it that if we're sitting for 8, 9, 10, 11 hours a day, which some people sadly are, what's happening is we're not creating movement in the body, and movement is life. Vagal tone is truly trainable, and inactivity actually detrains the vagus nerve. Reduced skeletal muscle pump activity, so getting the legs pumping and allowing for the flow of lymphatic fluid and the blood flow back up from the legs back into the heart and to the bloodstream, actually trigger a blunted baroreflex sensitivity and trigger low-grade inflammation that the vagus nerve's not able to then turn on cholinergic anti-inflammatory system. And so we're essentially not allowing the body to function at a high level because stagnation is occurring. This is not a go and do a hard workout recommendation. I'm not saying go and pump weight for one time crazy during the day in the middle of the day. That's not the intent here. The idea is move every 45 to 60 minutes. Break up your sitting time as much as possible. One of the best ways to do this is a 10-minute walk post meals, and then set an alarm every hour. Get up, move around, walk around. Most of us are sitting at desks working on computers all day. I've been doing that for today and tomorrow, and I'm planning this. And so I'm making sure to take moments where I step outside, get some fresh air, get some sunlight, and get out and do some squats. Do 10 squats while I'm outside. Get these movements of low intensity movement in so that my leg muscles can work better and I can turn on this skeletal muscle pump to be able to optimize my overall movement. The fourth sabotaging practice is evening screen time. There's two separate mechanisms by which this is going to sabotage vagus nerve function. The first one is through circadian sabotage. When we have light coming into our eyes, looking at screens evening time as the sun is setting, our body should be shifting into a state where we're not absorbing a whole bunch of light. When we have excess screen time, excess light coming into our eyes right before bed, what we're doing is we're deregulating the circadian rhythm. And so that's going to delay melatonin onset, which shifts the entire autonomic recovery rhythm at night, and it pushes it later. And so we're not getting the recovery process occurring first thing in the night. The second way is through a cognitive or arousal process, which is content driven. Many of us are doom scrolling for an hour at night before bed, and that's not healthy. It's actually content driven sympathetic activation. The scroll itself, independent of the light, where we're cognitively just consuming and absorbing these pieces of content is actually very negative for our overall health and for our vagus nerve in particular. It's not that blue light here is the villain. It's mistimed light. Light should only occur when, or ideally, when the sun is up, and we should minimize light at night or shut it off ideally. Intensity, duration, and timing matter far more than the color temperature does. The color temperature does matter, don't get me wrong, but those other pieces to the puzzle, the intensity of the light, the duration of the light, and the timing of the light matter far more. And daytime bright light exposure is protective. So this is why the going outside in the middle of the day, getting outdoors, spending time in fresh air is going to make that possible. What tends to happen is we have high latency of going to sleep, meaning that our sleep is delayed. It takes a lot longer to fall asleep. And we often think that we're kind of numbing our minds, but this is actually numbing a whole lot of our mind consciously and cognitively and triggering arousal at the same time. It's very negative to be sitting there on our screens doom scrolling for an hour before we go to bed. So a couple of effective fixes. First off, dim your overhead lighting 90 minutes before bed. Remove the phone from the bedroom if you can. Put it in a different room. Charge it elsewhere. That arousal fix matters as much as the light fix overall. So try to avoid the use of your electronics for at minimum 30 minutes before you go to sleep. Do a breathwork practice, read a physical book, do something else that's not as arousing and doesn't include the light component as well. The fifth issue here is kind of a broad statement, and that is unhealthy stress coping mechanisms. Unhealthy stress coping mechanisms are really the habit that makes the other 6 habits that I'm talking about very sticky. It's not the stressor that's the problem, it's the strategy here that's the problem. Many people lean into 4 coping mechanisms that are not healthy, and they tend to be things that we're using to try to feel more comfortable. The vagus nerve turns on through a feeling of safety. We want to feel safe, but sometimes some of our comfort-based practices actually don't create a feeling of safety. They're not actually safe in their root. These are practices like rumination or mental rehearsal, constantly thinking about a stressor, and that truly never ends when we're constantly playing it over in our heads. Numbing behaviors, things like alcohol, scrolling, food. These are habits 1, number 4, and number 2, wearing different hats, because comfort foods or using alcohol to numb or scrolling to shut our mind off are actually numbing behaviors, and they're creating a dissociation between the mind and the body. That's a big problem for a lot of us. Number 3 is avoidance and suppression. This is when we don't complete the stress cycle and there's no return to baseline. And number 4 is reactive overscheduling, responding to overwhelm with even more input. Vagal tone is the physiology of emotional regulation and flexibility. And what we need to start to do is create a connection between the mind and the body. This is what we call interoceptive awareness, actually noticing what's happening in your body, creating a conscious attention piece towards the internal state of your body. It's what distinguishes an adaptive coping mechanism from a maladaptive coping mechanism. You can't regulate a state if you don't know what's happening internally. You need to validate that first. So what works instead? HRV biofeedback training is one of the best tools you can do. And that just means feeling what's happening in your body through your breath practice. Right? And what this does is it simultaneously will help reduce rumination and perceived stress. When we start to put our attention outside of our minds and rather put our attention on the inside of our bodies and begin with bodily function, we actually are able to complete the stress cycle physically and create a shift to name an emotion and to create social co-regulation. HRV that recovers slowly after a stressful day or stays suppressed for 2 or 3 days after a single event is often a sign of rumination, overthinking, and worry. These are things we need to be really, really cognizant of. They are not healthy coping mechanisms. They're quite stressful for the body, and they're not helpful in the long run. The number 6 one is mouth and upper chest breathing, when we breathe through our mouth or we use our chest to breathe. The mechanism here is that habitual mouth breathing actually drives a shallow thoracic ventilation, preferentially filling the upper lung lobes, not the lower ones. And these upper lung lobes are rich in sympathetic nervous system receptors. And this bypasses the diaphragm, which the diaphragm is the muscle that initiates vagus nerve function. Now, the diaphragm is not directly innervated by the vagus nerve. It is directly innervated by the phrenic nerve. But when the diaphragm is active, it's creating the vacuum effect, allowing air to enter the lungs effectively, but at the same time, it's actually creating a motion pattern in the abdominal organs as well. And the abdominal organs are where the vagal inputs generally come to. The vagal inputs and 80% of the fibers on the vagus nerve are sending signals up to the brain from all of those organs. And so that diaphragmatic breath, using our belly to breathe effectively, is actually so important in bringing down or activating vagus nerve function through the mechanism of massaging out the organs below. Minimum effective fix here. There's going to be a couple different things that we can look at. You'll see respiratory rate on a wearable was kind of high. Breathing tolerance is kind of low during light exercise. These are markers that are telling you that you're not breathing correctly. And the minimum effective fix here is nasal breathing. Nasal, breathing through our nose, breathing into our belly, diaphragmatic breathing, and ideally longer exhales. Okay, so 4 seconds in through the nose, 6 seconds out. 4, 6. And what that pattern does is it shifts your breath pattern: nasal, diaphragmatic, longer exhale. Those are the 3 things we need to focus on to make sure that we're not breathing through our mouth, breathing into our chest, or focused on inhale over exhale. The 7th habit that's sabotaging vagus nerve function is chronic sleep debt and irregular sleep timing. This is a big one for a lot of people. Sleep is something that we need to put boundaries around and really, I don't want to say worship, but we really need to focus on building a moat around our sleep and protecting sleep to the greatest that we possibly can. Sleep deprivation truly shifts the autonomic balance towards sympathetic predominance. This is measurably true through decreased vagus nerve function and decreased HRV. And it's more striking that after a night of deprivation, the normal vagal response to physiological challenge is abolished entirely. It's not even just lower tone. It's just truly lost its adaptive capacity completely. Timing for your sleep matters independent of duration. Timing regularity matters so much. An irregular sleep midpoint disrupts your autonomic rhythm even when your total hours look adequate. So if you're starting sleep at 1 a.m., you're creating a much bigger issue in your overall health, even if you're sleeping until 8 or 9 a.m., because you're not getting that timing regularity just because one night per week you're sleeping super late. That is why the next day we tend to have a lot more sympathetic tone. We tend not to do so well that next day. It's a direct sign that most people are tracking the duration of their sleep, but we're not tracking the regularity. And we should ideally hit a midpoint that if you're using a wearable, it's very easy to kind of measure this. You should line up your alignment of your sleep to your optimal alignment. A marker for this would be that night-to-night HRV variance is quite wide, and there's a widening gap. Most often, these nights occur on the weekend. On a Friday night or Saturday night, we tend to stay out late or hang out with friends, and there's a lot of late activities that are occurring there. That's pushing our sleep midpoint back, and that's a big issue. So the minimum effective fix is fix your waking time first. Make sure that you're waking up at the same time or very close to it every single morning. And then that'll anchor the circadian rhythm because you'll start to get more tired and you'll start to fall asleep earlier. Your wake up time needs to be the anchored fix point first. This is really important for us to understand. A couple of honorable mentions on habit sabotaging the vagus nerve. Ultra-processed diet and gut dysbiosis alter vagal signaling from the gut, and these are worth their own episode entirely. This is something that we really want to focus on. Okay, so these are the 7 habits that I've found in my practice working with my clients that are truly sabotaging vagus nerve function and vagus nerve health. The first thing that we can do before we go and we buy a vagus nerve stimulator, before we go and jump into a cold plunge every week or every day, is to subtract something that's causing your vagus nerve to become dysfunctional in the first place. Subtract a habit, an unhealthy coping mechanism, alcohol, sleep deprivation, or sleep debt. These are all signs of triggers towards vagus nerve dysfunction. Start by subtracting what isn't working first, and then start to begin this process of adding new things to help support not only your HRV, but your vagus nerve function overall. Remember, the vagus nerve isn't broken and doesn't need to be hacked every single time. It's responding accurately to the signals that it's being sent. I want you to start changing the signals from the outside, and the response will then change. So I'm going to make this statement here, and I'm going to make a recommendation that you start a 1-week practice of eliminating or subtracting a certain habit from this list that you know that you're doing, that you'll defend the hardest, and to essentially remove or modify that for just 7 days and see what happens to your HRV. If you're measuring your HRV or if you're not, see how you feel. And I want to see how you do. 1 week, if you can do 2 weeks, go for 2 weeks. But I want you to take this moment to really bear down on eliminating a practice that is causing your vagus nerve to become dysfunctional in the first place. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I've enjoyed making it and talking, and I'm excited to catch you all on the next episode.